Okay, welcome everyone. We have a lot to cover today, so we are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Benjamin Orr. I'm the founder and executive director of the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that believes all Marylanders should be able to achieve their full potential in a healthy economy that offers a widely shared and rising standard of living. It's been a very hectic and challenging few weeks for all of us, and the news and policy responses have been moving quickly. We hope our session today will give you a better understanding of the new challenges we're facing and the policy options that can help us move forward together. One quick housekeeping note, today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to everyone who registered. So we will have two main speakers today. First, MDCEP's research analyst, Meyer, will give an overview of what we know about how this public health emergency will affect the economy. He will talk about what steps the federal government and state governments have taken so far to address the impact on families and businesses, and what additional steps would provide further protections. Then we will hear from Warren Deschenaux about the challenges faced by public finance in Maryland and how the current situation contrasts with that posed by the Great Recession just over a decade ago. As many of you no doubt know, Warren is the former executive director of the Maryland Department of Legislative Services, the nonpartisan agency that analyzes the state budget and proposed legislation for the General Assembly. And he just joined the Maryland Center on Economic Policy as a non-resident senior fellow. Warren will be commenting and writing on the current situation and how it affects state finances over the coming year. We plan to leave plenty of time to respond to your questions at the end. You can submit them at any time by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. That is the best way to submit questions. And with that, I will hand it off to Christopher Meyer.
Thank you, Ben. So as Ben said, I'm going to be going briefly over some of what we can expect in the coming weeks and months, both based on the most recent currently available data and based on some of Maryland's experiences during the Great Recession. So Callie, if you can go to my slide. So we really are in uncharted waters right now. On the left, that is a graph of weekly initial unemployment claims, so people who filed for unemployment insurance immediately after losing their jobs since 2000. That bump you can see in the middle is the Great Recession, and that spike you see at the end is the last 2 weeks of claims. So the number of claims we've seen in the past 2 weeks is comparable to a typical 6-month period total since the turn of the century, and is in fact higher than we've seen in any 3-month period at all. So it really is sort of an unprecedented situation with which both underscores the robustness of the response we're going to need to take, as well as underscores really the high degree of uncertainty about what we're going to be facing coming up. As of April 1st, the Economic Policy Institute estimated that Maryland was likely to lose nearly 350,000 private sector jobs by July, which is equivalent to about 1 in 7 private sector workers. Based on the last 2 weeks of jobless claims, it looks quite plausible that we could be exceeding that. So that does really underscore the seriousness of what we're facing. So the most important thing that should be on our minds right now really is what that means in terms of human impacts for Marylanders. And so to get a sense of that, we can look back to the Great Recession. So we can look at various indicators in terms of families who were unable to reliably put food on the table, that number increased by about half from the 2005 to 2007 period before the crisis to the height of the crisis, 2008 to 2010. So that was an increase from about 180,000 households in Maryland to 260,000 households. And then what we saw was that while the number increased sharply at the beginning of the crisis, the decline as the economy recovered was much slower. So even by the 2014 to 2016 period, as job growth was speeding up, as the Fed was considering raising rates, the number of Maryland households that couldn't always put food on the table was still 23% above its 2005 to 2007 level. So that's a pattern that we saw across a large number of human impacts, that the initial impact of the recession was fast and severe, and then in large part because of inadequacy of the policy response, the ensuing recovery was much slower. And of course, those human impacts are not evenly distributed across the population. So overall, from 2008 to 2013, which was really the height of the crisis in human terms, overall, 13% of households in Maryland couldn't always reliably afford to put food on the table. By comparison, 22% of Black-led households couldn't always afford to put food on the table. And among other households of color, 17% couldn't always put food on the table. And that's not just differences in the absolute number, but we see, in fact, the impact of the recession was greater. So overall, the number of households that couldn't reliably put food on the table increased by 4 percentage points, while among Black-led households, the increase was 9 percentage points. So we see, again, not just that households of color are facing greater barriers overall, but that they see much stronger impacts of changes in the state of the economy. We see a similar pattern with respect to housing affordability. So we know that, of course, the Great Recession was driven by the collapse of a housing bubble. And in fact, we did see before the recession, during the mid-aughts, that the number of families in Maryland who were struggling to afford housing, specifically those paying more than 30% of their income toward housing, was on the rise among both owners and renters. But then what we saw is that after the bubble burst, owners slowly, not quickly enough, but slowly started to see increases in housing affordability, whereas there was almost no improvement among renters. So by 2018, nearly half of renting households in Maryland still paid more than 30% of their income in housing, which is essentially the same as the number facing unaffordable housing costs at the height of the recession, and well above the number during the mid-aughts period. And again, these impacts were not distributed evenly across the state. So among white households, the total number facing unaffordable housing costs went from 28% before the recession to 31% at the height of the crisis. Among Black households, that number went from 44% to 48%. That's among both homeowners and renters. And among Latinx households, from 51% to 54%. And if you look by both race and housing tenure, you see even more stark differences. So among white homeowners, the number facing unaffordable housing costs went from 25% to 28%. Still too many, but if you look at Black and Latinx renters, it went from roughly half to a little over half. So again, not only do you see higher barriers facing Marylanders of color overall, but in many cases, the impact of the recession is greater. So not only did we see direct human costs from job losses and reduced income, but we also saw indirect costs because the state had a harder time paying for essential services. And that means that it was harder to provide every child a great education. It was harder to provide housing assistance and healthcare. And it also meant that the state became a drag on the recovery rather than contributing to it. So right at the height of the recession, state and local jobs actually fell at a slightly slower rate than private sector jobs. But then what we saw during the recovery, even as private sector job growth strengthened, state and local governments, because of inadequate revenue, remained well below the pre-recession peak. And so essentially that was both dragging down overall job growth and reducing demand at local businesses. So if we just take a look at the revenue loss, if you look at the actual revenue numbers, that understates the impact because we took some positive steps to increase revenue during that period. The sales tax, the personal income tax. But if you look at the tax base, we actually saw that the sales tax base in Maryland declined by about 23%. The personal income tax base declined by 15%. The property tax base, which is of course the most important revenue source for counties, fell by 26%. And the corporate income tax base fell by about 34%. And these losses didn't occur all at once, but rather over a number of years and on different schedules. So we really saw both severe revenue losses and long-lasting revenue losses. So that just gives us a sense of, based on past experience, what we can expect now. But we also know, of course, that this time is different. Last time it was caused by a collapsing housing bubble, and it really was entirely a demand-side recession. This time, what we're seeing, of course, is that workers actually are required to stay home for the sake of public health. And so you are seeing, or we're likely to see, impact on supply chains in terms of manufacturing, possibly transportation, possibly even agriculture. And what we're also seeing is, as we saw with initial jobless claims, is a much faster onset of the losses. And then finally, because of the widespread business closures in retail, food service, accommodations, this is having an especially great impact on low-wage workers. So now we'll quickly transition to what has been done so far and what remains to be done. And the short and bitter of it is that we've seen some positive steps, but not nearly enough to cushion the impact on families, on state and local revenues, and on jobs. So some positive steps we've seen are that at both the federal and the state level, there have been improvements made to unemployment insurance, expanding the number of triggering events, such as caring for a family member, or if you remain formally employed but your business is closed, as well as expanding who is eligible in terms of part-time workers, seasonal workers, gig workers, as well as expanding the scale of benefits to make sure that people are still able to afford basics. We've also seen positive steps with respect to healthcare. The federal government, for certain health costs related particularly to COVID-19 directly, is picking up a greater share of Medicaid costs. And the federal government has made testing available for free regardless of insurance coverage. But then there are big gaps. Most importantly, if you don't have health insurance and you test positive for COVID-19, then you need to pick up the tab for your own treatment. So it essentially leaves people high and dry. And that also increases the threat to public health, as if people are facing possibly thousands or tens of thousands of dollars in healthcare costs, they're not going to be able to get that treatment, and then they're going to wind up spreading the infection further. And then similarly, we see that so far federal legislation has not expanded food assistance at all, so that families who may be benefiting from unemployment insurance, some who aren't, still may not be able to put food on the table. And again, that both impacts their health, their general well-being, and also reduces overall demand in the economy, which affects local businesses. And finally, we've seen both some positive steps and truly inadequate steps on state and local revenue. Most importantly, at the federal level, there is $150 billion in general aid to state and local governments, as well as significant money specifically for education. From that general pot, Maryland got about $2.3 billion. About 2/3 of that, give or take, is going to the state government, while several hundred million are also going to the 5 largest local jurisdictions. So that is clearly better than nothing. But we know that the revenue losses are going to be both more severe and much longer lasting than that legislation is enough to cover. Just to give an example of what we saw during the Great Recession, federal education aid to state and local governments increased sharply for about 2 years, which really was able to help reduce some of the sharp education cuts. But then 2 years later, it completely dried up. And again, that meant both less educational resources available for children and fewer jobs and less demand in the economy. So we need to see that federal aid be both stronger overall and longer lasting. And I'm running out of time, so I just quickly want to talk about state and local revenues. The fact is that because the state is required to balance its operating budget, we really face a hard choice. We can cut services deeply, which likely means laying off large numbers of state and local workers or furloughing them, or we can raise revenue. And the fact is that raising revenue is the most pro-growth option that we have at this time, because we know if we lay off state and local workers who are making a decent but not extravagant living, they're immediately going to cut back on necessities, which will again mean a sharp drop in sales at local businesses. Whereas if we ask more of wealthy individuals and large corporations, because these often have significant savings and have a cushion, that's going to lead to a less dramatic impact on spending, and then a smaller impact on sales at local businesses. So again, to have the strongest and fastest recovery, and specifically the fastest growth, we really need to focus on raising revenues rather than making up for revenue losses simply through cuts. And with that, I will pass it along to Warren.
Thanks, Chris. Just a quick reminder that we'll be taking questions at the end. You can take questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So Warren, take us back to the last major recession and how Maryland addressed it. Obviously, while the situations that led to each recession were very different, there's still some lessons we can learn from the Great Recession as policymakers work to address this current crisis. So with that, take it away, Warren. Looks like you're still muted.
All right. Thanks, Ben. Typically, when in the past few years anyway, of given these little talks, I have started by saying how grateful I am for the opportunity to get out of the house. Well, I can't say that today, and neither may most of you, but that's the whole point, I think, of our getting together right now. As Christopher noted, there has been efforts from the federal government to, you can put the next slide up, to mitigate what the impacts might be on state and local governments. About $2.3 billion is being allocated out of 150 billion to Maryland. State government should be getting about 1.3 billion, and local governments with populations in excess of 500,000 will be getting $1 billion. So that's how we get to our total of 2.3 billion. But Congress has decided that this money should be used specifically, at least as I understand it, for costs directly associated with addressing the immediate health crisis. It is not intended, again, based on what I've been able to find out, to mitigate the impact on state and local revenues. So that, as Christopher implied, will have some significant effects on our capacity to support government activities at all levels. There will be additional direct payments to higher ed institutions, community colleges, school systems, and mass transit agencies. Again, with the exception of some of the higher ed money and mass transit agencies, the funding is limited in use to direct costs associated with addressing and mitigating the impact of the virus and the public health effects themselves. All right, next slide. All right, so some of this is going to be obvious, but I've learned through the years that it never hurts to state the obvious, because what's obvious to me isn't necessarily obvious to everybody else. All right, let's start looking at how sensitive our state income revenue structure is. If you put together the income and the sales tax and think about what that represents, it's about 85% of state revenues according to the fiscal 2021 budget, which is what was just approved a few weeks ago. Because of the impact of the virus, the tax due deadline has been moved from April 15th or April 30th if you're filing electronically to July 1. We are dealing with a casino revenue program, which has been shut down, that is used to support 6% of our pre-K through 12 education budget. At the local level, property taxes and income taxes represent about 75% of local owned source revenues. We were expecting, when the 2021 budget was passed, or at least expecting in terms of the budget document, that revenues for the fiscal year would increase over fiscal 2020 by about $600 million, or over 3%. And lastly, the state has set aside a rainy day fund, and it is set at about 1.2 billion, 150 million of which has been earmarked for state COVID expenses, and this will be supplemental to whatever the federal government federal government's revenues are used for. Okay, next. All right. Stating the obvious, this is not optimal. The depth and duration of the recession that we are we are undoubtedly in, is going to determine just how bad it gets. And we are specifically vulnerable in a couple of important ways. Let's start with the income tax. If we look at where that money comes from, the single largest category is wages and salaries. Lost wages due to unemployment are going to have a major impact. Now, how can we address this? Well, of course, the federal government has provided resources directly to businesses and directly to the unemployed and to individuals. However, it is conceivable that the state would also use some of its resources, either the $150 million, other money, or the federal money to further support incomes in the state. Okay. Another element of the income tax that we hear about from time to time is the capital gains tax. We tax capital gains at the same rate as ordinary income in the state. As we've learned through the years, the revenues from the capital gains income is quite variable. I suspect over the long haul, capital gains will not be growing. I've heard some talk that there will have been some realizations of capital gains as people sold stocks as the market was falling. I heard the same observations and expectations for the last two recessions, and frankly, I don't recall seeing much of a revenue bump as a result of a falling stock market. Okay. We've also moved the due date for tax payments. That's going to have an impact on the cash flow to the state, since the folks who are due refunds will file timely, and the folks who are going to pay will defer as long as they can. I don't think that's going to have a material impact on the ability of the state to get through fiscal year 2020, because there are, in all likelihood, other resources that can be put to use on a short-term basis. But we'll have to see how that works out. Now, the sales tax is a little more interesting. Now, clearly, the stay-at-home order is going to have a big impact on retail. Okay, now that's even with the exceptions for food, grocery stores, basically, liquor stores, and guns. It occurred to me initially that maybe liquor revenues would be helped out by the situation. But my son, who is accustomed to, well, has a social life, reminded me that a big chunk of the money will be coming from bars and restaurants, and we'll be losing that, sadly. We can expect significant drops in revenue from the sales tax, so long as the stay-at-home order remains in effect, and frankly, until people are feeling safe to go out and about. Okay. All right, the one potential bright spot in sales tax world is online sales. You would think that those will be steady and increasing as people continue to consume, but do so without going to retail establishments. And that's all fine, except that the legislature has chosen to dedicate monies from remote sales, the new proposed tax on internet advertising and on downloads and streaming, don't go into the state's general fund. They go into a dedicated account, again, to help support the blueprint for education funding. And therefore, those monies will not immediately be available to support general operations. They will, however, be available to help support the schools. I would point out, though, that the major revenue associated with that is the revenues associated with the internet advertising tax. And I think it's quite likely that it will take a fair time to implement. And I'm also reasonably certain that its effect will not take place immediately due to the foundation of the tax being litigated. So we'll just have to wait and see on how that money comes in. Education funding, pointed out earlier that 6% of our revenues for education comes from the Education Trust Fund. Well, for the duration of the stay-at-home order, I expect, well, casinos are closed. There is no revenue coming. The broad calculation is that for every week that the casinos are closed, that's $11 million of revenues lost. The total amount that's being expected from the casinos is about $450 million in the next fiscal year. So until the casinos are open, we're not going to be seeing that money, and the education accounts will be short by that amount. Now, I expect the casinos and probably policymakers will be interested in, if they can't open the casinos, at least supplementing the casinos' capacity to earn. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see some kind of pressure for internet gaming to be authorized either in a special session or soon. And I also wouldn't be surprised, because I just know these people, that the casinos themselves, being hurt financially as they are, will be seeking some kind of recompense in terms of an increased state share or something along those lines. And we'll have to talk about that as time goes by. Local governments, like I said, 75% of their revenues comes from the property tax and the income tax. Property tax is probably the principal source in most counties, but not all. And frankly, that tax base should remain fairly stable. Property values aren't going to go up. I am not certain, but I would expect that property values will stay fairly stable. To the extent that's true, then one of the major sources will be more or less secure. However, the income tax is going to be driven by the same factors that the state income tax is, and will undoubtedly put additional pressure on local governments. All right, so how does this compare to the Great Recession? All right, well, as a budget analyst, the principal similarity is that both of these occurred in the course of a major effort to increase funding for public education. Okay, but there are rather significant differences. The Great Recession just sort of snuck up on us. We didn't realize until we were at least a year in that we were even in a recession. We were initially just thinking we were in a slowdown that would eventually perk itself back up. The current situation is sudden and obvious and deep, and you know, we can't run away from it. And we need to take steps to mitigate as soon as we can. Also, the Great Recession followed a substantial increase in state revenues. You may recall that it's seared on my mind, but the 2007 special session, in which the sales tax was increased, the corporate income tax was increased, and sundry other changes were made to the revenue structure. The purpose of that was to deal with the cost of education and the underlying structural problem that had evolved in the budget in the preceding years. Now, the current administration has done nothing to address ongoing structural issues which continue to exist, notwithstanding the impact of COVID, and layered on that, has made no effort to support the increased costs of the Kirwan recommendations. And lastly, in the Great Recession, federal assistance to the states was specifically designed to support important government functions, Medicaid, public education, principal among them, okay? As I described earlier, at least as I understand it, the current federal support is limited simply to expenses related to addressing the public health crisis. So, the budget process, the state's budget process and situation has also evolved somewhat. During the Great Recession, the policy was to avoid use of the rainy day fund. The concern was that if we touched our rainy day fund, it would exhibit fiscal weakness and could imperil our AAA bond rating. Now, numerous other states had used their rainy day funds without having their bond ratings reduced, or at least not reduced for very long. But as a consequence, we went to great trouble to remove or to take money from various dedicated accounts program, open space being one of them, the Department of Transportation's Transportation Trust Fund being another, and so forth, raising some fees and some taxes in order to address the shortfalls without using rainy day fund balance below the 5% target at that time. Since then, the game has changed somewhat. The special interests that support the special funds have become very sensitive about their invasion. As a consequence, lock boxes have been put on the Education Trust Fund and the Department of Transportation's Transportation Trust Fund. Mandated repayments have been made to and mandated in the future to replace monies that were taken from other special funds. All right, so what's left? Well, that's the rainy day fund, cutting the budget, and finding new revenues. Now, as Christopher said, there is some fairness that attaches to applying and looking at new revenues, but that does not mean we will not be constraining spending or I hope this time using the rainy day fund. However, something to keep in mind is that we've allocated $150 million for COVID expenses, which leaves about $1 billion. And about $1 billion will support the operations of state government for about a month. So we will need to be augmenting that in some form or fashion. All right, so where does this leave us? As a state and as a nation, the most critical thing we can do is deal with the health emergency and get people healthy and back to their normal jobs as best they can and as quickly as we can, because the fiscal outlook isn't going to get better until we can do that. The revenue loss is going to be quick and it's going to be enormous. It is most critical that federal aid comparable to what was provided under the ARA be made available to the states to allow for the safety net to be maintained and to keep government running. But as we're doing that, and as we're applying both state and federal money, it's important that the funds be targeted to stated measurable objectives and that there be adequate oversight and accountability for that spending. That's it. Thanks. stay safe.
Thanks, Warren. Now we're going to start getting into audience questions. And as a reminder, you can submit questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We do already have a couple of questions coming in. So the first question is, during the Great Recession, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or Warren, as you said, the ARA Act, or ARA, adopted a policy of funding or financing shovel-ready infrastructure projects, that is, funding projects where construction could proceed quickly, and the questioner also notes that construction is at the moment considered an essential sector. This included some state and local programs on activities ranging from infrastructure to affordable housing. The question is Maryland pursuing a similar policy? And I think to extend that, is the federal government considering a similar policy?
Well, Nancy Pelosi has proposed that the next stimulus include a major infrastructure component. Frankly, I am not convinced that the shovel readiness requirement of ARA was particularly effective. And once that money was spent, there was not very much to show for it. So committing to larger infrastructure, things like the Howard Street Tunnel, and using federal money to further federal money to help with that could produce more lasting benefits. From the standpoint of the state legislature, considerable effort was made to identify capital budget projects, and the questions were consistently asked as to how quickly things could move. I am not at all sure that the responses to those questions were honest, because I don't have any specific sense that the projects moved any quicker than they normally would have. But that is another vehicle, so to speak, that the state can use, along with its Transportation Trust Fund, for infrastructure spending. Now, the Transportation Trust Fund is going to get hit just like the general fund is. Major source there is gas tax. The other major source is the vehicle titling tax. Well, I don't think people are traveling like they did, at least they're not supposed to. And vehicle sales, I think, are way off. So again, that agency is going to be suffering as well. So I hope that gets to the question.
I think so. So Chris, you talked about the potential need for revenue changes. Certainly there was a lot of discussion in the last legislative session, the shortened legislative session, around how to raise revenues to pay for education. Warren mentioned some of the policies that were implemented. The question is, do you think that there is political will to make these changes to revenue streams?
Thanks for the question. I want to start out by saying I, about 4 years ago, gave up on predicting the future and am giving up on that more every day. So the short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is we are facing some enormous challenges right now, and meeting any one of those challenges is going to require a great deal of political will. And I would say raising revenue requires a great deal of political will. I wouldn't even necessarily say that's more than the other challenges we have right now. So I would resist the temptation to say there isn't will for this. Let's try to find sort of a path of lower resistance. Ultimately, facing the challenges we face right now is going to require building that will.
Warren, did you have a comment as well?
Always. Yeah, in terms of, you can't get blood from a stone. Okay, if the economy is not moving, it's going to be hard to tax it and expect good results. The only place money can come from is where money is made, and that's the federal government. Okay, until and unless that instrument is applied to addressing the problem in a serious way, and the problem is resolved, I think looking to taxation as a solution for much of the problem is probably unhelpful. But that doesn't mean in the long haul that some re-examination of how we raise revenues and how much we raise will not be misplaced, or will not be misplaced. Okay.
And I would add, as I'm sure some of the funders on this call are thinking to themselves as well, that philanthropy can also not fill the gap. It really is going to require action by the federal government to fill the enormous gap that's been created in this current economic situation. The next question I have is, if the General Assembly does not go back into special session, how does the $1.3 billion from the federal government get allocated at the state level? Are there any constitutional limits on modifications to the state budget the General Assembly can make during the special session? I guess that's two questions there.
Well, under current budget, under the budget rules, unanticipated federal funds can be appropriated administratively by the governor with notice to the legislature and an opportunity to comment. Presumably contracts and things of that nature would still have to go through the process of the Board of Public Works to the extent those are subject to those requirements. So the legislature won't have to go into a special session to appropriate those monies. Again, the state has authorized the governor to use $150 million from the rainy day fund. So again, the governor has relative carte blanche with respect to those. I'm not sure if there are any accountability requirements. So we'll see. But I don't think the legislature has to come back for that reason. They may have other good reasons to do so, however.
Another question we've got is, and I think actually I'm going to combine two questions here, is are unemployment claims only being handled online right now? Is there a concern around some eligible folks who are having it applying? And I think the answer to that question is that they are taking applications, the state is taking applications over the phone and encouraging people to stagger their applications by the first initial of their last name to try and reduce the burden on the system. But Warren or Chris, if you've come across this, it is a question about in which month will the employment insurance fund run out that I do not know the answer to necessarily.
Yeah, I don't know that. But eventually.
Sorry, it took me a second to find my unmute button. I don't know that right now. I might be able to follow up for interested attendees with some very, very uncertain data.
So another question we got is going back to revenues. When we're looking at ways to increase revenue, is it possible that taxing services has less downside to the economy than increasing the income and sales tax? Chris, I know you looked at this a bit in terms of incidents, et cetera, during the last legislative session. If you want to take that one, a first stab at that.
Sure, I would say a few different things. One is regarding Warren's remark that you can't get blood from a stone. You know, clearly, as we think about the way the economy is changing right now in these weeks, I think that getting revenue from industries that are actually still operating, in which, for example, a person can work from home, is likely to generate more revenue than industries that are not operating. As far as the effect on the economy, I think that we need to distinguish between consumer services and business-to-business services. I think in both cases, the answer is no, that would not necessarily be more beneficial for the economy. So consumer services, the data do not tend to show that they're actually consumed disproportionately by high-income households. And we can think of, there are things like accounting services, legal services, but you also have, haircuts, car repairs that really just everybody purchases. And that's one reason why, in the long run, taxing services is prudent policy, just because it's an enormous part of the economy that's currently sort of arbitrarily left out. But in terms of asking more of those who have on whom it'll have the smallest spending impact, I wouldn't necessarily expect that to be less harmful than other tax increases, or especially, well, it might be less harmful than cutting services. But then in terms of business-to-business services, experts across the ideological spectrum agree that that is pretty problematic policy. Unlike things like corporate income tax, sales taxes are very easy to pass along to the consumer. And so, especially for something with a complex supply chain, you can see what's so-called pyramiding, where the inputs to a product are taxed at each level. So overall, I would say that that would not be among the best policy options.
We've just got time for a quick answers to one or maybe two more questions here. The question is if any of the federal money is currently specifically earmarked for nonprofit social welfare organizations. I know that nonprofits are eligible for some of the loan programs created through Small Business Administration in some of the bills. And I don't know if in terms of the other dollars, if there's any money that's going to flow necessarily. Chris or Warren, if you have.
I think if they're Medicaid providers, they're eligible.
Right.
Beyond that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think
I don't have anything to add beyond Warren.
Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of the support at the moment is because nonprofits are businesses, and so they have access to some of those things, although not all of them. And the last question is, I think a lot of people are thinking about this in the context of not necessarily the Great Recession, but the Spanish influenza outbreak, which I recently learned started in Kansas in 1918, 1919. Is there any sense yet of how many people might lose their homes or apartments if we're still dealing with this next year?
I think we can look to the experience of the Great Recession and, the kind of sobering statistics that Christopher shared. Again, unless there are serious efforts to, curtail foreclosures, which, unless the people can actually sustain the house, really doesn't help in the long run, or some other kind of intervention. That's where it's so critical to maintain income. Okay, and to the extent we can, just to keep people afloat so they can meet their obligations. And that includes mortgages, rents, and to the extent they can get paid through their current job, that's great. To the extent they can't, well then, supplemental sources need to be identified unless we want those and consequences to occur.
Yeah, I would largely agree with Warren there. I
Yay!
think, sorry?
I'm just happy you agree.
Oh. As we think about 2021, I think that we should assume that it will continue. I don't think that we should be planning for a quick transition back to business as usual. As far as people losing their homes, obviously, there is some question if you kick tenants or homeowners out, who's going to buy or rent the home afterwards. So that could have some effect. It's hard to say, but definitely both at the federal and state level, we need stronger protections for homeowners and especially for renters, who we know are likely to have the lowest income and are disproportionately Marylanders of color. One example being that protections shouldn't be limited to people who can, very clearly establish a link from COVID-19 to lost income to being unable to keep up with rent. This is something that affects every single one of us, and making those protections and that assistance available to as many people as possible, as easily as possible, really is key to supporting the economy and getting us back on track eventually.
So unfortunately, that's all the questions we have time for. Thank you very much for joining us today. Everybody will receive a follow-up email with the slides and a link to the webinar recording. As this situation continues to evolve, the Maryland Center on Economic Policy will be following developments closely and posting regular updates on our blog and social media channels. You can see all those links on our screen here. I also encourage you to sign up for our email list at mdeconomy.org. Thank you again to Warren, Chris, and everyone who joined us today. I wish you the best to you and both your families as we all navigate this difficult moment. Thank you.